Few franchises have attempted the storytelling ambition of Mass Effect. The games tell the story of Commander Shepard and his or her crew as they dart across the galaxy. The player's decisions made throughout the missions of this sprawling franchise affect a number of variables, from crew availability to galactic governmental leadership. Today, on Origin of the Series, we'll be examining the history and evolution of the Mass Effect Trilogy, starting with the founding of BioWare to the eve of Mass Effect Andromeda. Welcome to Origin of the Series, Mass Effect. Ray Muzica, Greg Zashuk, and Augustine Yip founded BioWare in 1995 after graduating medical school at the University of Alberta. The three doctors had learned game programming as a hobby, but soon realized that game design was their true passion. The money they had earned as doctors gave them the startup capital needed, and soon production on their first game was underway. BioWare has tremendous RPG bones, there's no doubt about that. However, their earliest effort was a game in the vein of MechWarrior called Shattered Steel. They put the game out to various publishers before eventually deciding to sign with Fallout creator Interplay. Shattered Steel was successful enough for BioWare to become more ambitious for their second game. Like many game developers, the fledgling company was inspired by pen and paper role-playing games. BioWare toyed around with several concepts, ultimately creating a demo called Battleground Infinity. This game would not be developed, however. Instead, BioWare used the code to create the Infinity Engine. This game engine powered the first bona fide hit for the young company, Baldur's Gate. The game development caused some attrition in the ranks, though. Augustine Yip was the first founder to leave the company, preferring the medical field over the tremendous grind of game development. For the foreseeable future, Muzica and Zashuk would remain at the company. BioWare's Infinity Engine would be licensed for Icewind Dale and Planescape Torment. However, the company's next big project was a sequel to an action game called MDK. MDK 2 received praise and laid the groundwork for BioWare's future of mixing RPGs and action. BioWare followed MDK 2 with a sequel to Baldur's Gate. Unfortunately, BioWare's publisher Interplay had fallen on hard times and would end up in bankruptcy. Quite possibly the most important precursor to the development of Mass Effect was Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. On the heels of another RPG success in Neverwinter Nights, BioWare was approached by LucasArts to develop a new Star Wars game, set 4,000 years before the events of the movies. The resulting game was BioWare's most polished at the time. Knights of the Old Republic's release also grew BioWare's recognition in the gaming community at large. BioWare produced an original game for Microsoft's Xbox console called Jade Empire while wrapping up Knights of the Old Republic. The game was designed using similar concepts as KOTOR and would be a success in its own right. Soon after, BioWare began working on a new IP that they envisioned as a story with a grand scope. They envisioned a game that would use similar mechanics to Knights of the Old Republic, such as the ability to travel from planet to planet. BioWare had begun to craft the universe of Mass Effect. Casey Hudson, who had successfully directed Knights of the Old Republic, would serve as the director on Mass Effect. Casey and the team needed to lock down the genre concepts that would be used in the Mass Effect universe before any development started.
And actually, when you think about issues like, should you have time travel? Should you be able to warp somewhere? Is there cloning? Is there artificial intelligence that, there are robots that, are as smart as we are? Those kinds of things actually dictate the things that you can do in the story. Because if you can do time travel, or even if you can warp across the battlefield, that radically changes everything about your story, the way the game plays, everything. So we had to kind of lock those things down first before we started building our story.
The game's development cycle would take 4 years, the first 8 months being spent on refining the concept. Concept art was the backbone of Mass Effect's design. Art director Derek Watts and his team used photographs to generate ideas for planets. For example, the concept art for the planet Vermeer was based on Vietnam. In addition to photography, Casey Hudson said that literary and film inspirations were used to set the tone for the art and the story. These included The Wrath of Khan, Blade Runner, and 2001: A Space Odyssey. Mass Effect artists were given free rein to design the alien races. Artist Matt Rhodes described it as wish fulfillment. The artists designed each race to fit some sort of niche. The Solarians were warrior poets. The Krogan were badasses. The Turians were warlords. The design for the Asari was intended to fit the sci-fi trope of blue-skinned space babes, That can be seen in both Star Wars and Star Trek franchises. According to Rhodes, the race that was the most difficult to design was the Geth. They originally started out as an organic life form before artwork of a skinless type of alien inspired them to create something more artificial. During the design of all the aliens, the concept artists and the animators would work together to ensure that whatever wacky creation the artists came up with could actually be rigged and animated properly. One of the biggest design choices in the game was the ability for the player to make decisions that impacted the story of not only the current game, but games that would follow it. The decision function was very broad and featured nearly 700 decisions that would impact the way certain events unfolded for the player. The plot of the game follows Commander Shepard and crew as they travel from planet to planet, uncovering the mystery of an ancient race of giant biomachine aliens called the Reapers. The story builds up to a conflict with a Reaper named Sovereign, who is only a precursor of what is to come in the following games. According to Corey Andrusko and Dusty Everman, the level design process in Mass Effect was one of the most difficult areas of the game's development. The process would start with the writers generating plot for a level, before moving on to the level artists, who made a 2D map, and then a block version of the level. After that, the work would happen in different silos. The level artists would create art, the writers would create dialogue, animators would work on cutscenes, and the technical designers would work on the combat. What resulted were efforts that didn't work well with each other and unplanned iterations. Despite these troubles, the team managed to pull the level design together in the end. The method of creating the sound effects for the game was inspired by the way Ben Burtt created the effects for the original Star Wars. The sound design team created recordings modified at the source of the sound and avoided a lot of digital post-processing work. It was this method that led the team to recording the effect that would be used for the main villain of the first game. A rusty garbage can lid would be slowed down and pitched down into the ominous hum of the Reaper Sovereign.
The before was just, well, it's just this. It's, a garbage can lid being manipulated. And then the after turned into that, which is our money sound.
The partnership that owned BioWare since 2005 was acquired by Electronic Arts in October 2007, 1 month before the release of Mass Effect. In the transition, BioWare became one of the business units of Electronic Arts, maintaining its own branding and structure. When the game was released in November 2007, it was to rave reviews. The most positive reviews raved about the decision-making and the broad scope of the game, while the most critical reviews hammered home on the actual gameplay, something that BioWare would take to heart for the sequel. Mass Effect would go on to win numerous awards, recognized as one of the best RPGs of the year. With Mass Effect being a hit, it would only make sense that Mass Effect 2 would be more of the same, a continuation of the story. That didn't happen. Mass Effect 2's gameplay would be redesigned, with many of the RPG elements tweaked, and a greater emphasis on the shooting aspect of the gameplay. In a 2010 interview on GamesRadar.com, lead designer Christina Norman said that the design team took 81 days to just focus on the combat balance with the RPG mechanics turned off. She said, "We forgot labels and made a great game." There were fans concerned with the new direction, but Norman and team continued undeterred. The behind-the-scenes process for designing levels was also polished quite a bit. As I mentioned earlier, the level design style that was used in Mass Effect 1 had the problem of having a silo mentality in the design. The things that worked in isolation for each silo would not work when meshed together with the other elements, causing negative effects on team efficiency. This type of design was so problematic that content like the planet Calliston ended up getting cut. Andrusko and Everman did a terrific job at the 2009 Game Developers Conference of breaking down these problems and how they were addressed in time for Mass Effect 2. The level design was broken down into phases, starting with a narrative overview or story. Each following phase allowed the entire team to work together to iteratively develop the levels. The decision tree in Mass Effect 2 continued to expand. Casey Hudson, while speaking with Games Radar, explained a bit on how the writers work to carry the decisions over. "We find places where key characters can be ones from a previous storyline, or where the plot should work differently based on decisions you've made in the past." The story of Mass Effect 2 takes place 2 years after the first one. Shepard had been killed in action not long after the events in Mass Effect 1. A company named Cerberus finds the corpse and tries to revive Shepard. The story continues the main thread of discovering the motivation behind the oncoming Reaper assault. Through the game, Shepard has the opportunity to recruit additional crew members, as well as take on special side quests to earn their loyalty. The primary antagonists in Mass Effect 2 are a mysterious insectoid race known as the Collectors, but by the end, the stage has been set for a full Reaper invasion in Mass Effect 3. With the number of changes that were made between the sequel and the original, it would be understandable if the game's release and budget were skewed. The world had just started going through the Great Recession and money was starting to tighten up. Despite this, the release date and budget maintained, a fact made even more amazing when you consider that the H1N1 virus hit the BioWare offices particularly hard. Hudson said, "Just as we were pushing to finish the game, much of the team went down with illness, and we lost over a man-year of time over the span of a couple of months." Mass Effect 2 was released on January 26, 2010. The critical reception was astounding. By most measures, Mass Effect 2 is considered to be the best in the series, combining the refinements to the player controls and inventory system with possibly the most satisfying story of the three games. The development of Mass Effect 3 was the shortest production cycle of the original trilogy. The technology and gameplay used to make Mass Effect 2 was already in place, allowing for the development team to rapidly proceed with production. The game began production before the release of Mass Effect 2, with many of the principals, such as Casey Hudson, game designer Preston Watamaniak, and writer Mac Walters returning. Drew Karpyshyn, who had written Mass Effect 1 and co-wrote Mass Effect 2 with Mac, did not return. Jack Wall, lead composer of Mass Effect 1 and 2, also did not return. According to Engadget, Wall said during a panel discussion that the reasons for his departure were that despite best intentions, relationships with clients like BioWare can get complicated. Clint Mansell, the composer of the film Black Swan, would take over for Wall as the lead composer. The game's plot revolved around the Reaper invasion, starting with their arrival right from the get-go. Shepard's goal is to find a weapon that could destroy the Reapers once and for all. The most interesting thing about the development of the story, though, was after the game was already released. In the original cut of the game, there were 3 endings that the player could arrive at by making a choice in the final moments. The ending left most players, myself included, just a tad unsatisfied, and many voiced their concerns to BioWare. Not long after the game's release, BioWare took the feedback to heart and created an extended ending, providing more closure to the player. This topic is interesting because it brings about the greater point of how much an ending is required for a game. Is the depth and breadth of the ending relative to the size of the game itself? Or would a short but well-written ending have satisfied the players? Either way, the extended cut sheds more light on the characters' choices throughout the games, as well as providing a 4th possible ending. Mass Effect 3 was released on March 6, 2012, and again received critical acclaim. However, much like the 3rd Christopher Nolan Batman film, it was a case of the series having peaked in the 2nd installment. Perhaps it was the initial endings that caused the slight downturn, but the overall review scores tracked just a bit lower for Mass Effect 3. Not long after the release, there would be some changes at BioWare, with the remaining 2 founders, Muzika and Zashuk, heading off into retirement after 17 years of being in various executive positions at the company. Casey Hudson, who had directed all 3 installments, would also leave in 2014, but not before serving as an executive producer on the early stages of Mass Effect Andromeda. Mac Walters, co-writer of Mass Effect 2 and the writer of Mass Effect 3, would take over for Hudson as the director of the Mass Effect series. When I was a kid, the most popular RPGs that I would play were all JRPGs. Final Fantasy, Suikoden, and their ilk were what defined my experience. BioWare's Mass Effect series carved out an RPG niche that I didn't realize I was looking for, something that had a little more action while still maintaining the story of broad scope, and an advancement system born out of RPG elements. To me, the legacy of the franchise will be that of helping to define what the action RPG could become. That'll do it for today's episode. Let me know what you thought by leaving a like, dislike, or a comment below. As always, I will have a pinned fact check comment if there is anything clearly wrong. I will be doing an expansion pack to this series in the future, a bit after Andromeda's release, so keep an eye out for that. If you enjoy this stuff, consider subscribing with notifications. My name is Spoiler Kevin, and I'll see you in the next video.